A castle wall, this massive stone barrier, it stands for power, unshakable power. But you look at each stone, and every one was a response to a new weapon, something terrifying. This was a medieval arms race, a constant back and forth, smashing force on one side, and on the other, cunning stone. It changed how wars were fought. Completely. So you see ruins now, these old castles. They're not just silent monuments, they're like fossilized conversations. The conversation between attack and defense, captured in rock. A single machine could come along, and architects would have to rethink everything, redesign entire fortresses, and siege tactics, the darkest ones. They changed where people kept their food, where they kept their water permanently. A labyrinth of walls, a falling counterweight, they're connected. The threat from underground, it's what created the moat. That iconic shape, the answers are in the engineering, a hidden world of it. So what makes a defense unbreakable? What's the most important ingredient? Stone wasn't the first answer. The first answer was earth and timber. You had these early Norman castles, the Moat and Bailey. A high earthen mound, the Moat, with a wooden tower on top. And around its base, a courtyard, the Bailey, protected by a wooden palisade on another earthen bank. It was a statement of control, built fast to hold conquered land. But it was a statement written in kindling, and the siege tools of that time matched that. They matched its vulnerability. A group with axes could chop through the palisade. Archers could send fire arrows to set it all ablaze. The battering ram, the most basic siege engine, could reduce a wooden gate to splinters in hours. These were symbols of power, but they were temporary. They were perilously temporary. Then a new pressure arrived, not from men with axes, but from machines that could strike from a distance. The Romans had perfected torsion artillery, like the onager and the ballista. That knowledge never fully went away. The onager, named for the wild donkey and its kick, used twisted ropes to swing a massive arm and hurl a stone. The ballista, like a giant crossbow, could fire a heavy bolt with enough force to go through a man and the man behind him. These weren't tools for a quick assault. They were instruments for a systematic breakdown. A commander could sit back beyond arrow range and hammer a wooden fortress into matchsticks. That changed everything. You couldn't just build high anymore, you had to build strong. The existence of these engines forced a material revolution. Wood was obsolete. The response was to reach for the most durable thing available, stone. As the historian Jim Bradbury noted, the stone castle was a direct response to the increasing power of siege artillery. This wasn't about grandeur, it was a raw military imperative. Masons weren't just building walls, they were building shields, thick, towering shields of rock. The old wooden keep on the Moat was replaced by a massive stone tower, the keep. The flimsy palisade around the Bailey became a formidable curtain wall, but even the shape of stone had to adapt. A square tower with flat surfaces was a perfect target. A heavy stone from an onager would hit a flat wall and transfer all its energy into one spot, cracking the masonry. So builders began to think like deflectors. They started rounding the towers. A rounded surface, they found, could glance a projectile off, make it skid and tumble away. The impact was dispersed, not concentrated. That was the first major lesson in the new language of defense. Every curve, every thickness was a reply to a question posed by a machine. The age of the permanent stone fortress had begun. Not from a desire for permanence, but from the urgent need to survive the next thing hurled at it from the dark. The stone wall was a shield. Then a machine came along that could just throw its answer right over the top. That was the trebuchet. It changed the whole game. Earlier engines were powerful, but the trebuchet was different. It used gravity. a huge counterweight, a box filled with tons of earth and stone, was winched up high. You released it, it fell, and it swung a long arm that launched a projectile from a sling, a high arc. This wasn't just throwing a rock, it was throwing a much heavier rock, much farther, and with real precision. You could adjust the weight, adjust the release, to hit the same spot on a wall again and again, like a hammer. The psychological effect was huge. Defenders on a tall wall would just watch. A boulder the size of a cart would sail over their heads and smash into the courtyard behind them. Or the payload wasn't stone. In some sieges, they'd load diseased animal remains into the sling. To spread illness inside, the trebuchet meant safety behind one wall was an illusion. It could just go over the front door, so architects had to think in layers. If one wall wasn't enough, you built 2 or 3. That's the concentric castle, a castle within a castle, a lower outer wall, then a higher, stronger inner wall. The space between them was a trap, the killing zone. Even if attackers broke the outer wall with rams or trebuchets, their reward was to be funneled into this narrow corridor. And from the taller inner wall above, defenders could fire down, arrows, stones, boiling liquid from every direction, no cover, no way forward but through another, stronger gate. It was defense in depth. The trebuchet, this machine built to destroy walls, it forced the creation of the most complex fortresses. It turned the castle from a stronghold into a labyrinth, where every victory for the attacker was just a step deeper into a puzzle, a stone puzzle designed to consume them. The real danger wasn't something you could see. You had to listen for it under your feet, a scraping sound deep in the dark. While the trebuchets were hitting from above, another kind of soldier was working below. In total silence, they were miners, sappers. Their fight wasn't about noise, it was about patience and collapse. These teams would start a tunnel far from the walls where you couldn't see them. They'd dig deep, using timber to hold the earth up as they went, getting closer to a tower's foundation, to a section of wall. Then, at the right time, they'd stack kindling and rags against those wooden supports and light it. They'd run back through the tunnel as it burned. The wood would go. The earth above would have nothing holding it, and then a huge part of the castle's base would just fall away. A tower could lean and crack. It could come down into rubble without a single stone hitting it from the outside. It was defeat from within, the ground itself betraying the castle. So how do you stop an enemy you can't see, one you can't even reach? You change the ground. The first answer was water. If you can't stop the digging, you stop it from starting. That's the military purpose of the moat. It wasn't just a wet ditch, it was a solution. A deep, water-filled moat created a barrier of liquid earth. You couldn't dig a stable tunnel through it. The walls would cave in, it would flood, it was impossible, but water was a luxury. Not every castle had a river or a spring to fill a huge ditch, so builders looked to dry geology. They looked for bedrock. They built foundations right on solid stone, stone no pick could get through, and when the land wasn't perfect, they engineered it. Look at the base of Krak des Chevaliers, the great Crusader castle. The lower walls don't go straight up, they slope outward, a smooth stone apron called a glacis. That did two things. First, it made tunneling a nightmare. Starting at the bottom of that slope meant digging a huge distance just to get under the wall. Second, it turned dropped stones into weapons. A rock dropped from above wouldn't just fall down, it would hit this smooth slope and ricochet horizontally. Like a stone from a sling, cutting through anyone at the base. The landscape wasn't passive anymore. Through ditches and water and shaped stone, the earth became a guardian. The silent war underground made defenders think like geologists. It turned the castle from a thing on the land into part of the land, a living system. The most frightening response to a wall was a wall that could move, the siege tower, a fortress on wheels, taller than the castle's own battlements, covered in wet hides to resist fire. Inside ladders, platforms, it was a mobile bridge, a way to bring an entire assault force right to the defender's doorstep to take their greatest advantage, height, and use it against them. Teams of men or oxen would pull this creaking giant forward, inch by inch, across filled ditches under arrows. Its only purpose was to close that final gap and pour soldiers directly onto the wall walk. It promised to erase the distance completely. The castle's answer to this rolling threat was to extend itself outward into the air. They built wooden galleries that projected out over the wall like permanent balconies. Hoardings, from inside them, defenders could look straight down the face of their own walls, but wood was vulnerable, so the innovation became permanent, carved from the castle's own stone. Machicolations, sections of the parapet floor built out on stone brackets with openings between them. To someone on the wall walk, it was just a patterned floor. To anyone below, a death sentence from above. The entire summit of the wall changed. It was no longer just a place to stand and shoot arrows outward. It became an active platform designed to project force straight down. Through those openings, defenders could drop heavy stones or pour cauldrons of heated sand or quicklime directly onto the heads of attackers at the base. They could target men placing scaling ladders or a team pushing a battering ram. The historian Charles Coulson noted that machicolations are the architectural expression of vertical defense. The siege tower tried to meet the defender on equal footing, but the castle's answer was to refuse the meeting. It created a zone of absolute peril in the one place the attackers had to be, right against the stone. The fight was no longer just across a gap. It was a vertical battle where the castle reached down from its heights to strike. This grim rain from above meant that even reaching the wall wasn't safety. It was the start of a new vulnerability. The castle had its own immune system. Its real enemy wasn't always the machine outside the walls. It was what that machine could send inside. The trebuchet didn't always throw stone. Sometimes it threw terror. Commanders knew breaking a wall was one thing, but breaking the spirit of the people behind it, that was something else. A different kind of ammunition would come over the battlements, the remains of animals, other unsettling things. They'd land in the crowded bailey. The goal was contamination. To spoil the water, to spread illness, to make every breath feel unsafe. It was a psychological siege, targeting the mind and the body at once. It turned the castle from a refuge into a potential trap. Where the very air and water could become enemies, that threat reshaped the fortress from the inside out. Every design decision now answered a question. A chilling question: what if nothing clean can get in? The answer was to make the castle a self-contained world. The well became the heart of the entire defense. It was always dug deep, usually within the thickest part of the keep, the final redoubt. Protecting that water source was survival, not just comfort. Food storage was just as critical. Vast, cool cellars and granaries were built to hold months of supplies, even years. A castle's strength was measured in barrels of grain and salted meat. As much as in the height of its walls, even the most basic needs were re-engineered for security. The latrine, usually a small room built out from the wall. With a chute dropping below, it was a necessary vulnerability. These guardrabes had to be designed so they couldn't become a secret entrance. Their outlets were often high above a moat, or a steep drop, making them impossible to climb. Every system, from water to waste, had to be managed internally. The community inside had to be prepared for a state of prolonged isolation. Grim isolation. They weren't just waiting for an assault. They were waiting out a shadow, the slow, creeping threat of scarcity and sickness. The architecture of daily life, the placement of a pantry, the path to a well became a direct response to this unseen warfare. The fortress learned to feed itself, to water itself, to endure in silence. It became an island, designed to survive when the world outside wanted it to forget what safety even felt like. The thickest wall still has a breaking point, a new sound arrived in the medieval world. It would eventually drown out the trebuchet, the miner's pick. The thunder of early cannon. These first bombards were crude, monstrous iron tubes bound with hoops. They fired stone balls with more noise and smoke than accuracy. Slow to load, dangerous, they could explode as often as they fired, but their potential was terrifying. A solid stone shot, when it hit, could chip and crack masonry. Masonry that had laughed off catapults for centuries. The psychological shock was a weapon. The ground seemed to tremble with a new authority. Castle architects faced this new threat with a familiar material. More stone. Their first response was a brute force calculation. If a wall 3 meters thick could be damaged, then a wall 6 meters thick might hold. So they thickened everything. Existing curtain walls got massive backs added, like a shield reinforced with another shield. New fortresses began to look different. Lower, squatter, hugging the earth, towers became more rounded, or they were built as stout cylinders, drum towers, no flat surface for a cannonball to strike squarely. The goal was no longer just to deflect, it was to absorb, to take the punch. Some builders took absorption to its logical extreme. They backed their stone walls with packed earth. The stone face would take the impact, the earth behind would swallow the energy, stop the shockwave from shattering the masonry. Others sloped the bases of their walls outward. That glacis shape, but on a monumental scale. A cannonball striking a slope would ricochet upwards, or its force would dissipate along the angle. You can see this transitional struggle in the stone of late medieval strongholds. From the 100 Years' War, they are grim, dense, overwhelmingly heavy. They represent a holding action, the final, desperate innovation of the classic stone castle. Builders were buying time, piling ton upon ton of rock in a race against the increasing power of the guns. They created fortresses less about elegant vertical defense, more about sheer, stubborn mass, a last great bulwark. But this was a battle of diminishing returns. For every meter of thickness added, the gunmakers could forge a larger bore, a stronger powder charge. The arithmetic was turning against the stone. A revolution in design was coming, one that would not try to out-muscle the cannon, but would outthink it completely. The age of the angled bastion, the geometric fortress, was waiting, a new answer to the oldest question: how to survive. Stone had gone as far as it could. The age of just piling up mass was over. The answer to the cannon wasn't more rock, it was a different geometry, a geometry of angles. The high silhouette of the medieval castle, with its towers and battlements, became a problem. To a cannonball, that tall profile was just a bigger target. So the fortress had to get low, it had to spread out, and it had to think in lines of sight. That was the star fort, the trace italienne. It didn't look like a castle at all. It was a sprawling, geometric shape laid flat on the ground. Its walls were low and thick and sloped outward, a glacis meant to deflect shot, but the real idea was in the shape. Instead of round towers, it had pointed bastions. These angular projections, like the points of a star, jutted out from the wall. Each bastion was placed so its sides could provide covering fire for the wall next to it. There was no safe place to stand outside. Every inch of ground in front was covered by guns from another bastion. It was the killing zone idea from concentric castles, but perfected and turned outward. The blind spot was gone. The threat from miners was answered too, but in reverse. Instead of a deep moat to stop tunnels, star forts often had broad, dry ditches. And beyond those, a complex landscape of outworks, lower walls, detached triangular forts called ravelins, zigzagging trenches. An attacking army wouldn't face just one wall. They'd have to get through a series of obstacles, each one covering the next with fire. Defense in depth, refined to a mathematical art. The ghost of the castle lived on, not in the form, but in the function. The principles learned over centuries, deflect, overlap, layer, were now expressed in earth and angled stone. Vauban, the great military engineer, didn't invent new ideas so much as he perfected this old conversation. His fortresses were the ultimate synthesis. They were machines for defense where every slope and angle had a calculated purpose, so the medieval arms race never really ended. It just changed its language. The dialogue between the wall and the weapon that could break it set a logic of response. Each new threat forced a reinvention, not just of a building, but of a way of thinking about space and protection and power. The solutions to the trebuchet and the early cannon became the axioms for the bastion, and those axioms would, later, shape the bunkers and defensive lines of wars centuries after. The castle didn't vanish, it evolved. Its legacy isn't a ruined tower, it's a principle, the principle that a defense is never finished. It's always a reply waiting for the next question. The loudest weapon could be silence. Where you'd expect sound trade, carts on a road, boats on a river, there was nothing. That was the economic siege. Not breaking walls, but encircling them with a quiet, patient absence. It changed what a castle was. It wasn't just a fortress anymore. It became a living thing. An organism that had to eat, that had to drink. So when an army surrounded a place, their first move was often to poison the well without ever touching the water. They'd cut the roads, patrol the riverbanks, stop every merchant. The goal was to make the outside world vanish, to turn the castle into an island of dwindling supplies. In that kind of war, the trebuchet hardly mattered. The real battle was in the granary, in the cistern. A castle's strength was measured in months. How long could its people last? That pressure forced a reimagining. A castle couldn't just be a barracks for soldiers. It had to become a miniature city, a strategic reserve built for endurance. Architects and lords started thinking like quartermasters. The design began to include spaces we don't associate with war. Huge storerooms were dug into bedrock to keep grain cool and dry for years. Bakeries and breweries were built inside the inner walls, so the work of turning grain into food and drink could continue. A forge was vital, not just for weapons, but to repair tools, shoe horses, maintain the machinery of daily life. The castle became a factory for its own survival. This need for absolute control over access reshaped the entrance. The gatehouse evolved from a simple door into a deadly, multi-layered puzzle. You'd approach a heavy oak door reinforced with iron, but before you reached it, you had to pass under a first portcullis, a spiked iron grate suspended above. If you got past that, you entered a narrow stone passage. Above you, the ceiling was dotted with murder holes. From rooms upstairs, defenders could drop stones or pour unpleasant things directly onto anyone trapped below. At the end of this tunnel waited a second, heavier portcullis, and often a final set of immense doors. The whole structure was a choke point, designed to be defended by a handful of men against an army. It was architecture as a filter, allowing commerce in peacetime but becoming an impassable throat in war. Location selection changed too. The best defensive hill might be worthless if it had no water. So castles were built where they could support life. A reliable spring or well was non-negotiable, often dug deep within the keep itself. Proximity to fertile land became a strategic advantage. Some castle domains included vineyards, fish ponds, fields within a day's walk. The fortress was the nucleus of a self-sufficient estate. In peace, it administered and protected the local economy. In war, it could retreat into itself, drawing on the resources it had gathered and stored. This turned the castle into the ultimate anchor of the feudal landscape. Its power wasn't just in its battlements, it was in its barns. A lord who could guarantee food and safety during a crisis commanded a loyalty deeper than fear. The economic siege did more than influence architecture. It embedded these stone giants into the fabric of society. They became centers of resilience. Symbols of a stability that could, in theory, outlast any storm. But this evolution came with a vulnerability. It made the castle's human heart the community it sheltered, its most critical point of defense. And that would lead to the most intimate and most brutal form of siege warfare. That self-sufficient island still had to see, it had to know, the thickest walls didn't matter if you were blind inside them. So beyond stone and supplies, the castle mastered something else, the control of information. Every siege was a duel of awareness, who knew more and who knew it first. Outside, the camp became a hive of signals, not just shouts, a coded language. Flags of different colors and patterns, raised on poles, could relay orders across the noise. Horn blasts in specific sequences, long, short, too quick, could coordinate an assault or sound a retreat. For longer distances, they used the oldest system. Carrier pigeons carried in a tiny cage on a soldier's belt, released to fly home with a scrap of parchment, a report on enemy movements, a call for reinforcements. The siege camp was a nervous system stretching threads back to a distant command. Silence was a weapon and noise was a code. Inside, the architecture was designed to win that information war. The High Keep wasn't just a last refuge, it was a watchtower. From its summit, a lookout had a view for miles. He could see dust clouds on the horizon. Count tents spot the glow of forge fires at night, hinting at new engines being built. The castle saw everything, but seeing out also meant not being seen. That's the arrow slit. It looks like a simple vertical cut in the stone, but it's a carefully engineered window. On the outside, the opening is just a narrow slit, almost impossible to hit. On the inside, it widens into a splayed chamber that gave the defender inside a wide field of view. He could track an attacker's approach, and he had room to draw a bow in almost any direction. It was a one-way mirror made of stone. Movement inside the castle was also communication, engineered for advantage. The spiral staircases, in almost every fortress, they twist clockwise as you ascend. That was a deliberate choice. A right-handed attacker climbing would have the central pillar on his left cramping his swing. The defender above, coming down, would have his right arm free, with the open side of the steps to swing his weapon. The architecture handed him the superior position. Every step was a message. In the deepest quiet, even whispers had to travel. Builders sometimes carved narrow, twisting tubes within the walls, or left thin, speaking passages between rooms. A commander in the gatehouse could hear a whispered report from a guard high on the wall. A warning could pass from the keep to the barracks without crossing an open courtyard. That turned the castle from a collection of rooms into a single, connected organism. It could hear a footfall at its gate and react in its heart, so the ultimate defense wasn't just mass. It was awareness. The fortress was built to gather more information faster and act on it. It was a sensory being. Its eyes were the arrow slits and tower tops. Its ears were the speaking tubes. Its voice was the coordinated movement of its defenders, guided by the logic of its staircases and walls. In the silent contest of knowing, the castle was designed to be one step ahead, to turn the fog of war into a clear advantage. But this intelligence had a limit. It relied on human loyalty, on the will of the people inside, and when that will broke, no amount of clever stone could hold the line. The final and most unpredictable siege weapon was always the human spirit. The stone began to anticipate the soldier. Warfare had become professional. And a new threat appeared, not from a machine, but from a man with a contract, the mercenary. These weren't farmers who'd been conscripted, they were specialists, often organized into international companies, selling their skill to the highest bidder. The Italian condottieri, the German landsknechts, they brought a standardized approach to violence. They drilled, they coordinated, and they used their weapons with a new, terrifying precision. Their presence on a battlefield wasn't just a force of arms. It was a force of knowledge, a knowledge the castle walls had to learn, and quickly. Take the crossbowman, not a local archer with a longbow, a professional with a steel prod crossbow. This weapon could punch through armor at 100 paces. It needed less training than a longbow, but in the hands of a specialist, it was a tool of surgical terror. A defender looking out from a traditional arrow slit had a limited view. He had to lean into the opening to see, against a professional crossbowman who knew the exact range, who could wait for a target to appear. That was a death sentence. So the arrow slit changed. Masons began carving a small, round hole at the base of the vertical slit. This murder hole, this oilet, it changed everything. A defender could now look down through this hole with almost no exposure, surveying the ground directly below the wall. He could track the approach of those disciplined troops without showing his face as a target. The architecture adapted to the shooter's skill. It gave the defender the same protected, unhurried sightline the mercenary had from a distance. The fear of these coordinated professionals reshaped the very approach to the castle. A band of local militia might charge a gatehouse in a disorganized rush. A company of condottieri would probe for weakness methodically, using covering fire. Coordinated assaults, the response was to turn the entrance into a gauntlet, the Barbican. This was no longer just a gatehouse, it was a freestanding, fortified outwork. A stone funnel placed in front of the main gate. To reach the castle, attackers had to first breach the Barbican's outer door, then navigate a narrow, walled passage that twisted and turned. All the while exposed from above and from the main walls behind them. It was a trap designed for professional soldiers. It forced their disciplined ranks into a confused crush. Where individual skill meant nothing, the Barbican didn't just defend a door. It dismantled the unit cohesion that made mercenaries so dangerous. Even the threat from below, from mining, became a specialized trade. Mercenary armies often traveled with their own corps of sappers, men who made a career of digging under walls. Their very existence justified the massive investment. Rock-cut foundations, deep moats, those sloping stone aprons. A lord wasn't just building against a possibility. He was building against a known professional capability that could be hired by any rival. This created a pan-European dialogue in stone, a defensive innovation in England born from fighting Welsh longbowmen might be studied and adapted in Italy a generation later. Because the mercenaries who had seen it would carry that knowledge to their next contract, the castle wall in France might bear the subtle imprint of a countermeasure first devised in the Holy Land. Because the engineers who had served there now sold their services in a continental war, so the walls tell a story of an anonymous, international class of soldier. The silent pressure of their collective expertise with the crossbow, the drill, the pickaxe-shaped curves and angles as surely as any trebuchet's impact. The fortress became a physical record of a human arms race. It was built not just to stop an army, but to outthink a professional, to turn his greatest strengths, discipline, technique, standardized equipment into vulnerabilities within a stone labyrinth designed just for him. The stone language always spoke to two audiences. To the soldier outside, it was a set of problems, but to the community inside and to rival lords watching from a distance, it was a story. A story carved in rock. The most brilliant defensive idea could fail if it only worked during an assault. Its real power was often in preventing that assault from ever starting. This was the symbolic side of the arms race, where engineering became theater and the castle itself was the lead actor, playing a part of absolute, unshakable power. Think of a traveler approaching a great fortress for the first time. They see it from miles away, a silhouette against the sky, not just a building but a jagged crown of stone on the horizon. As they get closer, the details come into view: the sheer, windowless lower walls, the dark, yawning mouth of the moat, the multiple layers of battlements, each one higher than the last. And then the gatehouse, not a simple door but a cliff face of masonry, studded with the dark slots of murder holes and the teeth of a raised portcullis. The message isn't subtle, it's a calculated performance. Every feature says the same thing: do not try. This was deterrence made permanent. A lord investing in a concentric design with its complex layers wasn't just buying security. He was purchasing a reputation. He was demonstrating that he commanded the resources, the skilled masons, and the strategic knowledge to build the latest, most sophisticated model of defense. It was the medieval equivalent of parading a new weapons system. The message to a rival was clear: attacking me would be catastrophically expensive, in lives, in time, in treasure. You might win, but the cost would break you. Better to seek an alliance or simply look elsewhere. The psychological effect was a weapon as real as any trebuchet. A chronicler from the period might note that the mere sight of a well-garrisoned castle could cause an advancing army to change its entire campaign plan. Why besiege the impregnable rock when the next valley overheld a weaker, older fortress? The design could literally divert conflict. It made the castle a geopolitical tool. A lord could secure his borders not just with soldiers, but with the intimidating shadow his walls cast across the countryside. This symbolic function shaped the architecture in surprising ways. Take the Grand Gatehouse. Militarily, it was a deadly funnel, the ultimate choke point. But on a peaceful day, when the portcullis was raised and the doors stood open, it served a second, equally vital role. It was the ceremonial entrance. A visiting dignitary, a trading delegation, would have to pass under its grim machinery. They would feel the cool shadow of its towering walls, see the murder holes above their heads, and walk the long, echoing passage. Before they even met the Lord, they had been humbled. They had been made to feel small. The architecture itself enforced the social order, announcing the Lord's dominance before he spoke a single word. This was political propaganda in stone. The constant innovation driven by siege technology amplified this message. When a lord rebuilt his square towers into round ones after hearing of a new, more powerful catapult, he was doing more than strengthening his walls. He was advertising his connection to a network of military knowledge. He was showing he was current, adaptive, and therefore formidable. The castle became a living resume of a lord's capability and reach. Even the materials spoke. Imported stone from a distant quarry, intricate carvings around the chapel window, the height of the great hall's ceiling. These weren't just aesthetic choices. They were declarations of wealth and cultural sophistication. They told subjects and rivals alike that this lord was not merely a warlord in a crude fort. He was a permanent institution. His authority was as deeply founded and intricately constructed as the fortress itself. So the dialogue of siege and defense was never just technical. It was a public conversation about power. Every new answer to a weapon became a new line in a story of invincibility. The moat wasn't just a ditch, it was a statement of separation. The Machicolations weren't just chutes for dropping stones. They were a visible promise of a grim, vertical defense to any who looked up. The castle stood as a permanent, intimidating advertisement. It blended absolute martial necessity with the timeless art of political theater, creating an edifice where the message of dominance and the means of survival were finally the same unbreakable stone. The strongest wall a castle ever had wasn't built, it was already there, the land itself. Geography became the ultimate defense, a silent partner in the whole arms race. Builders knew that the right location could make the most powerful siege weapon useless before it was even set up. That's defense by selection, a preemptive strike against the very idea of an attack. The trebuchet, that master of gravity, needed a stable, flat platform. Its huge counterweight required a firm foundation to swing from. Put a castle on the crest of a steep hill, and you take that platform away. There's no place to build the machine within range. The slope becomes a shield. It deflects the whole geometry of the assault before it starts. Look at the great castles of Wales like Conway or Harlech. They aren't just on hills, they are of the hills. Their foundations are the living bedrock, the bones of the mountain, and that did more than stop trebuchets. It made the sappers' job a nightmare. Mining teams trying to tunnel under a wall would hit solid rock on the first swing. The cost in time and tools became too high. The natural rock wasn't just a base, it was an extension of the wall going deep into the earth where no shovel could reach. This environmental strategy shaped entire campaigns. In Scotland, a castle like Stirling sits on a volcanic crag, cliffs on 3 sides. An approaching army had just one narrow, uphill route. A siege tower, that rolling fortress, couldn't be moved into position. The land funneled attackers into a single, miserable corridor, exposed and vulnerable. The castle's strength didn't just come from thick walls. It came from the 1,000 feet of empty air beneath the battlements. The landscape did the hard work. It forced the enemy into such a disadvantage that an assault seemed foolish from the beginning. Water was another geographic weapon. A castle built on a point surrounded by a river bend like Durham Castle created a natural moat on a huge scale. The river's current was a permanent, flowing barrier. It limited where siege camps could be set, complicated the attackers' supply lines, made a full encirclement a puzzle. On coasts, fortresses were perched on sea cliffs. The land approach was narrow, and the sheer drop to the sea made an attack from that side unthinkable. The environment provided layered defense for free. The wind, the tide, the cliff face, these were permanent, tireless guards. This integration was a masterstroke. It acknowledged the limits of siegecraft and exploited them. By using topography, a lord could reduce the power of siege engines without adding a single stone to his walls. He was using the Earth's own architecture as his first, most resilient line of defense. So the choice of location was the earliest, most critical decision. A preemptive counter-siege technology. It showed that the most sophisticated defense sometimes needed no elaborate masonry at all. Just a deep understanding of the land, a willingness to let the natural world join the fight. The castle didn't conquer the landscape, it married it. A hybrid fortress where human engineering and immutable geology became one thing. A city of wood and canvas would appear, right outside the stone walls. A siege camp, a temporary city for 10,000 people. It was an offensive machine, but a fragile one. A massive logistical puzzle. Every single day, it needed mountains of grain. Hay, water. Its forges had to roar, turning iron into bolts and axe heads. Carpenters worked in open yards, building the giant frames of trebuchets. This whole operation was the attacker's lifeline. And that made it the defender's target. The castle wasn't a passive box. Its design evolved to turn the attacker's greatest strength, his numbers, into a vulnerability. The key was a small door, the postern gate, often hidden on a less visible side behind ivy maybe or near the moat. It wasn't for grand arrivals, it was for silent exits. Under darkness or during a barrage, a small force could slip out, knights, men at arms. Their mission wasn't to defeat the army, it was to sabotage the system. To dash to the siege camp's edge and set the carpentry yard on fire, to torch the stacked timber for a new siege tower, to stampede the oxen, scatter the horses. A successful sally could set an attack back by weeks. An army would watch months of labor vanish in a single night's fire. The castle's layout enabled these strikes. The outer bailey, that broad courtyard, wasn't just empty space. It was a mustering ground, a launch ramp. Its gates were positioned for a straight, clear charge into the field. The killing zone between the walls, so deadly for attackers coming in, became a safe corridor for defenders going out. They could erupt from the gatehouse, hit their target, and retreat back along the same path before the besiegers could organize. The architecture facilitated offensive defense. This struggle extended to the most basic resource, water. A castle's well was its absolute lifeline, dug deep within the keep. But the fear of poisoning from upstream was constant. So water supply became an exercise in protected hydrology. Builders sought springs originating deep within the castle's own bedrock, impossible to access from outside. At Gaylard, Richard the Lionheart's fortress, the well was sunk through 100 feet of solid rock, drawing from a source completely isolated from the landscape. The water wasn't just stored, it was geologically hidden. The siege camp, for all its noise, was a tense balancing act. Its supply lines stretched for miles, a thin thread vulnerable to interception. Its workshops were clusters of dry timber, its latrines a health hazard. Every necessity was a point of potential collapse. The intelligent castle was designed not just to withstand a beating, but to administer one. It forced the besieger to guard not just the castle walls, but his own bread ovens, his own horse lines, his own engineers. It stretched the attacker's focus thin. This turned the siege from a simple act of surrounding a place into a complex duel. Two systems pitted against each other, one of permanent, resilient stone, the other of temporary, vulnerable logistics. The castle watched, it waited, and when the moment was right, it would reach out from behind its walls with a sudden strike. Not to win the war in a day, but to unravel the delicate web that made the war possible. The real contest was often not over the height of the walls, but over who would run out of food first, of tools, of willpower, and in that contest the silent postern gate could be as decisive as the loudest trebuchet. The most powerful ideas traveled with the armies. A French soldier standing in the dust before a Syrian fortress would see something new, not just an enemy stronghold. It was a textbook, a lesson in stone written in a different language. The Crusades moved more than armies, they moved minds. They created this brutal, accelerated marketplace for the science of defense. For the first time on that scale, the military architects of Western Europe and the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world were all facing the same problems, under the same punishing sun, and they were watching each other's solutions. The European knight, raised on the idea of the tall, square keep, arrived to find fortifications that thought differently. Castles of the Seljuk Turks and later the Ayyubids, they often had rounded towers. Long before those were common in the West, their walls were thicker. Their gatehouses were more complex. They were built with this profound understanding of the terrain on these impossible hilltops. To the Crusaders, these weren't just obstacles. They were revelations, a defensive logic that had evolved under different pressures, now offering new answers. So when the Crusaders began building their own strongholds like Krak des Chevaliers, they didn't just import French designs. They adapted, they blended the massive, layered strength of European keeps with the sophisticated, terrain-hugging layouts they had seen. The result was something new. The concentric castle, with its rings of walls, is the symbol of that fusion. Its origins are debated, but many historians see in its geometry the clear influence of Byzantine and Islamic military architecture. Concepts the crusading orders witnessed and then mastered, but the exchange wasn't one way. The Crusaders brought their own formidable toolkit. They were experts in the heavy, deliberate siege. The systematic use of mining and countermining became a refined art in the Levant. A dark, underground duel where European sappers and defenders learned from and taught their counterparts. The Crusaders' persistent use of siege towers and massive trebuchets, it forced Islamic engineers to innovate their own defenses at a breakneck pace. It was a brutal feedback loop. A new defensive feature on a Muslim castle would be studied, captured, and its principles copied. A new Crusader siege technique would be endured, analyzed, and countered in the next fortress built. This turned the Eastern Mediterranean into a living laboratory. The military orders, like the Knights Hospitaller, they became the perfect agents of this exchange. They were permanent, disciplined, focused solely on war. Their great castles in Cyprus, on the coasts of Greece, in the Holy Land, they weren't just garrisons. They were experimental stations, places where the best ideas from Normandy, from Constantinople, from Damascus and Cairo could be fused into a single, terrifyingly efficient design. And they tested these hybrids against the most determined foes imaginable. This period shatters the idea of a linear European evolution of the castle. What we see instead is a global dialogue, a conversation shouted across battlements, whispered in captured engineering plans, etched into the stone of hybrid fortresses from Wales to Syria. The Crusades acted as a massive catalyst. They compressed decades of trial and error into years. They proved that in the arms race between the wall and the weapon, no culture had a monopoly on genius. The next great leap in defense could come from anywhere, even from the mind of an enemy. The stone walls held the weight of a promise, a grim one. Everyone understood it. The rules of a siege were a dark contract written in fear. Before the first catapult was built, there was often a formal demand to surrender, a chance to avoid bloodshed. But it also set the terms. If the garrison refused and the castle was later taken by storm, the attacking commander was within his rights to let his soldiers take the fortress by force. The consequences were severe. This wasn't just warfare, it was the legal and social framework around it, the threat of what happened if the walls fell, that incentivized a defense to the last. It bound everyone inside together, from the lord to the lowest servant, in a shared, desperate project. Their fates were cemented into the same stone. This pressure shaped time itself. The grace period, that final window to surrender after a breach was made. It meant a castle didn't just need to be strong. It needed to be strong for a specific, critical duration. Holding out for those extra days could mean the difference between a negotiated surrender and a catastrophic assault. The architecture had to buy that time. The concentric design with its layers wasn't just about killing zones, it was about creating a series of deadlines. Each fallen wall gave the defenders a new, smaller perimeter to defend, and with it, a new moment to consider their position, to send out a herald to negotiate. The castle became a clock, its ticking measured in falling stones and dwindling supplies. Within this tense framework, certain spaces took on a somber importance. The chapel was never just a place of worship. During a siege, it became a sanctuary for the spirit, a place for final rites, for solace. Its location was often deep within the inner bailey or the keep itself, the most protected part. Its thick walls offered a quiet defiance against the chaos outside, a space to prepare for any outcome. And the Lord's chambers, the Great Hall, they weren't merely for comfort. They were stages for the human drama of decision-making. Would they hold? Would they treat for terms? These rooms had to allow for private counsel, for heated debate away from the ears of the frightened garrison. The social hierarchy, so rigid in peace, had to function under immense strain. The castle's layout facilitated that. The ultimate expression of this legal reality was the keep. This massive tower was the final redoubt. If the outer walls fell, the defenders could retreat here, bar the last door, and prepare for a last stand. But its purpose was often more nuanced. A strong, intact keep, even with the courtyard lost, was still a formidable problem. Storming it would be costly. This gave the defending lord a powerful bargaining chip. From within its secure walls, he could negotiate terms. He could secure safe passage for his family and his soldiers. The keep, therefore, wasn't just a military strongpoint. It was a diplomatic chamber. Its very existence guaranteed a seat at the table, even in defeat. Its design, a single, stout tower with its own water and storerooms, was a physical guarantee of that negotiating power. This legal shadow stretched down to the garrison's quarters. The men who manned the walls lived with the knowledge of the stakes. Their dormitories, their armories, the access routes to the battlements, all were designed for efficiency and resilience. But they were also designed to manage morale, to prevent panic, the ability to quickly reinforce a threatened sector, to maintain communication, to ensure a steady supply to the fighting positions. That was about sustaining the will to fight as much as the ability to fight. The castle had to be a machine for preserving human resolve under the most extreme pressure. It was built not just to stop an army, but to house a society facing its darkest possible hour. Every corridor, every room, every thick wall was part of a system intended to navigate the narrow path between honorable surrender and utter ruin. The stone was cold, but the rules it was built to serve were brutally clear. That stone had a cost, a huge one. Every defensive advance, every thicker wall, every new ring was a mountain of money turned solid. The race between siege and defense was fought with gold as much as with force. To build the new designs, the ones demanded by the trebuchet or the early cannon, you needed more than a clever mind. You needed a treasury. Just quarrying the stone was a massive industry. Teams of laborers, skilled masons, carpenters for the scaffolds, carters with their oxen, all of them had to be paid, fed and housed for years. A deep, stone-lined moat wasn't just a ditch. It was a months-long dig. This economic fact created a filter, a brutal one. Only the richest monarchs, the great military orders, the most powerful lords could afford the latest fortress model. If you couldn't pay for the upgrade, your castle wasn't just old, it was a liability, a symbol of weakness right there on the land. Look at the ruins now, scattered in the countryside, those ivy-covered shells. Many weren't destroyed in some great siege, they were just left. Their owners, a lesser baron or a knight, they looked at the cost, rounding the square towers, thickening the walls to the new standard. They saw the numbers were impossible. They couldn't finance the change, so they walked away. They moved their household to a newer, safer property if they had one, or they accepted a lower status. The old castle was left to the weather, to slow decay. Its stones were often taken for other buildings. What we see as a picturesque ruin was back then a declaration of economic defeat. A fortress that became too expensive to keep in the race. This financial pressure sped up the centralization of power. Military strength got tied to vast wealth. The king, with his national taxes, he could build the concentric marvels, the state-of-the-art forts on the frontiers. A local lord could not. This slowly drew the real power of defense upward. Away from the feudal nobility toward the new nation-state, the castle, once the symbol of local, independent authority, became in many places a tool of royal control. Garrisoned by the king's own men, the arms race didn't just change walls, it changed politics. It made sure the landscape of power was dominated by those who could afford the most sophisticated stone. The ruins tell two stories. They're monuments to martial ingenuity, yes, but they're also tombstones for a kind of independence. They mark the point where progress, in the form of a new siege weapon, became so costly it forced a consolidation. The march of military engineering didn't just leave older designs behind. It left entire tiers of the aristocracy behind. The field of battle was cleared not by swords but by account books. The surviving giants, the Krak des Chevaliers, the great royal fortresses, they stand as evidence of a system that could marshal almost unimaginable resources. Their silent, enduring strength is the final product of an economy poured into stone, a permanent victory, bought at a price only the very few could ever pay. The culture kept telling itself this story about the perfect fortress. It moved from the mason's yard into the songs people sang. When reality hit its limit, imagination would step in. Legends started to spread. There were stories about mythical engines. Alexander the Great's catapults, they said, could throw fireballs hot enough to melt stone. And then there were whispers about this monstrous boar, a drill powered by 100 oxen that could chew right through a mountain. And on the other side, you had stories about castles with a single, impossible floor. A gate that could only be opened from the inside by someone with a pure heart. Or a foundation stone that, if you pulled it out, the whole structure would just crumble. These weren't just fantasies, they were a kind of cultural pressure. They set a bar, they defined what patrons and engineers dreamed they could achieve. The quest for something unbreachable was a philosophical ideal as much as a military one. It pushed architects to look for a kind of geometric perfection in their designs. A shape so logically sound it would defy any attack. You can see that in the later star forts with their obsessive symmetry. Their bastions were placed with this mathematical precision. They were attempts to take that myth of invincibility and translate it into a workable, earthly form, and ancient stories got retold through this medieval lens. The fall of Troy, with its famous wooden horse, became less about a gift and more about the ultimate ruse in siegecraft, a lesson that the strongest walls could be undone not by force but by deception. By cunning, the biblical story of Jericho, where the walls fell after trumpets were blown, that was interpreted as a parable, a story about faith and persistence overcoming what seemed like insurmountable fortifications. These allegories kept pointing back to a central, uncomfortable truth, that no wall, however thick, was ever truly final. Its strength always depended on the minds and the spirits of the people behind it. This mythical dimension of the arms race reveals a deep anxiety. It shows a world grappling with a terrifying idea that for every defense there might eventually be an answer. The stories of ultimate weapons and the stories of ultimate fortresses, they were two sides of the same cultural coin, a cycle of fear and ambition, and this mythological thinking had a real, tangible effect. It encouraged patrons to fund more ambitious projects, to reach for designs that pushed the very limits of what engineering could do and what a treasury could afford. The dream of the perfect geometric defense, the castle without a blind spot, that was a direct offspring of these legends. It was an attempt to make the storybook ideal real. And while practical constraints always grounded these dreams, the cost, the materials, the laws of physics, they still fueled generations of innovation. The castle, in the end, was more than a pile of strategic stone. It was a character in a grand, ongoing narrative, a story about human vulnerability and our endless, ingenious struggle to feel safe. The ruins we walk through today, they're the physical chapters of that story, where every arch and every arrow slit whispers of a world trying, against all odds, to build something that could last forever. The search for a perfect defense was just trial and error. For every good idea that caught on, there were so many that didn't. You can see them in the ruins, these dead ends. Experiments that didn't work. It shows you it wasn't some straight line of progress. It was messy. It was wasteful, just people trying things. Some failures came from too much cleverness. A lord or a builder wanting total security might design something incredibly complex, a gatehouse where the path inside wasn't a straight hall, it was a puzzle. Moving floor sections, interior pits with bridges, doors that only opened if you pulled levers in the right order from another room. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, during an attack with the smoke and the noise, it was a problem. Defenders might forget the steps, a weight could get stuck, the whole complicated machine would fail. Maybe trap your own men inside. The best defenses were usually simple, a thick door with a bar, a portcullis that drops when you cut one rope. Under the pressure of a siege, complexity often broke. Other times it was the wrong material. A builder with plenty of beautiful limestone might use it for the whole wall. It looked strong, it was easy to shape. But then the first cannons show up, and that stone had a weakness. It wasn't like dense sandstone or granite, which could take a hit. Limestone was brittle. A cannonball could make it shatter, send sharp pieces flying into the fortress, leave a huge, ragged hole, so what worked before became a weakness later. Choosing your stone was a gamble, and sometimes they lost, finding out too late their walls couldn't handle the new weapons. There were also designs that tried too hard. The idea of a killing zone between walls was good, but some architects, to make the approach impossible, made the entrance passages too narrow, too twisted. Filled with too many barriers, and that became a trap for their own side. Your own soldiers couldn't move quickly from inside to help the outer wall. A retreat could get stuck in a bottleneck. The design, meant to slow the enemy, ended up freezing the defenders. It gave up all flexibility just to block the way. And a castle has to let its own people move. That's a basic rule. Looking at these old, broken ideas teaches you something. The change in castle design didn't come from perfect geniuses. It came from people testing things. Some ideas were brilliant and everyone copied them. Others looked clever on a plan but were a disaster in real life. Many were just too costly for what they gave you, so nobody tried again. But each failure taught them something. It showed masons what not to do. It proved a defense could be too clever or too stiff or made from the wrong material. These dead ends in stone are part of the story. They show that every good feature, every machicolation, every arrow slit that worked, lasted because it passed through a filter. The filter of real attacks, real money, and the laws of physics. A ruined experiment says as much as a great fortress that still stands. It tells you that progress is built on discarded dreams, too. Not just the things that lasted. The castle learned to shout back. For centuries, its strength was in silence, in how much it could take. But gunpowder artillery changed that. Now the fortress could reach out and strike. This wasn't just adding cannons to the walls. It was a total reimagining. The castle's purpose shifted from a passive shield to an active platform of fire. Towers were rebuilt. They once had narrow slits for archers. Now they had a new opening, the gun port, the embrasure. It was a wide, splayed hole, often shaped like a keyhole. The wide outer part gave the cannon a broad field of fire. The inner, narrow section protected the gunners inside. From these ports, the castle's guns could do something new. They could sweep the ground with grapeshot, a spray of metal pieces, like a giant shotgun cutting down infantry before they reached the ditch, or they could target the attacker's own siege engines. Smashing trebuchets and towers while they were still being built, the castle was no longer waiting, it was initiating. This shift changed the shape of the battlements. The classic tooth-like pattern, the merlons and crenels, had to be re-engineered. The solid merlons became thicker, much thicker, to withstand the blast and give cover to the gun crews. The gaps, the crenels, were widened to give the cannons room to recoil, to let the thick, acrid smoke clear. Walking the wall walk now meant navigating a landscape built for heavy machinery. Not just for men with bows, this integration created a new fortress, an artillery castle. The line between defensive architecture and offensive weapon system blurred. Then it vanished. The strength of the place was now tied to the range and power of the guns it housed. Its walls were no longer just barriers, they were firing positions. Platforms for a coordinated defense that sought to dominate the territory around it, to keep the enemy at arm's length through projected force, and this new role came with its own stresses. The structure now had to endure not just impacts from outside, but constant vibrations from within. Every time a cannon fired, the stonework trembled. Architects had to consider the weight, the recoil, reinforcing floors and building sturdy platforms. They had to design for the choking fumes, ensuring ventilation so the gunners wouldn't be overwhelmed in their own stone chambers. The very fabric of the fortress was adapting to live with the beast it now housed. It was a profound layer in the long transformation. For centuries, siege technology had been an external pressure, a problem posed from outside the walls. Now that same technology, refined, captured, turned inward, had been absorbed into the defense's own body. The attacker's greatest tool had been taken, brought inside and pointed back at him. The dialogue between the wall and the weapon reached its most intimate point. They were now one and the same. A single entity designed to see, to reach, and to answer violence with a thunder of its own. The age of the silent fortress was over. The age of the thundering fortress had begun. But the sea brought its own kind of siege. A fortress on a cliff wasn't just watching the land. It was facing the horizon, and out there the threat took a new shape. The warship, a floating castle with its own heavy guns that changed everything. A land army had to drag its cannons for miles. A ship could just sail right up, its broadside already loaded and aimed. The naval assault was this sudden, concentrated hammer blow from the water, and the coastal castle had to become a different kind of shield. You could see it in the silhouette. On the landward side, you might still have the traditional towers, but you turned to face the sea, and there the walls were lower, thicker, brutally rounded. Those massive, drum-shaped bastions weren't for archers. They were shaped for deflection. A cannonball fired from a rolling ship, aimed at a curved stone surface, was far more likely to just glance off. Into the surf, it was the same logic as the rounded tower, but amplified for a more powerful enemy, a more mobile one. The whole fortress became a layered firing platform. Look at Deal Castle in England, built by Henry VIII. It's this squat, concentric flower of stone sunk low into the ground. The walls are a honeycomb of gun ports. And these ports are clever. They're often that keyhole shape, wide on the outside so the cannon's muzzle can swivel, narrow on the inside to protect the crew. That gave each gun a sweeping arc of fire. The design wasn't about picking off soldiers. It was about creating a wall of iron, a deadly zone across the beach and the approach channel. A zone no ship could cross unharmed. The harbor itself became a weaponized space. A castle guarding a port, like the great fortress of St. Malo, didn't just have walls. It had a controlled throat. The water gate was a fortified entrance. There were chains that could be raised underwater to block ships, towers on either side crammed with guns. An enemy vessel trying to force the harbor would have to sail a slow, predictable path, right under the muzzles of dozens of cannons, firing from point-blank range. It was a maritime killing zone, and the threat wasn't only cannon fire. There was the constant fear of marine sappers. Teams could row in under cover of darkness during a storm. Try to plant explosives at the base of the seawalls or scale them with grapnels. The response was in the details. Foundations were often built on tidal rocks, submerged at high tide, making them impossible to approach quietly. Walls rising from the water were made sheer and smooth, sometimes with an outward curve at the top. To prevent grappling hooks from finding a hold, the castle extended its defenses right down into the waves that created perhaps the most dramatic fortifications of all. Places like Mont Saint-Michel or the fortress city of Dubrovnik. Here, the moat was the ocean itself. The siege could only come when the tide allowed. The architecture married itself to the rhythms of the sea. These were castles that used geography as their primary defender, and then layered every known military innovation on top of it. They had to withstand not just the pounding of guns, but the relentless corrosion of salt spray and storm. The naval dimension forced a pure, brutal kind of engineering. There was no room for decorative grandeur on the seaward side, only sheer, stubborn mass and calculated angles. It was a specialized branch of the arms race, where the enemy's platform was as mobile as the wind, and the castle's answer was to become an unmovable, bristling rock, a final statement that even the open sea, that ancient highway of trade and threat, could be commanded from the land by those who knew how to build, not just for armies but for the tides and for the broadsides of kings. Time was the hidden currency in a siege. The clock was always ticking. Inside the walls, they were counting days until a friendly army might appear. Outside, the commander was counting the hours until his own supplies ran low or illness spread through the camp. This race against time reshaped the machines. It reshaped the stone. Think of a trebuchet, building one from scratch at a siege site was a massive project. It could take weeks where an army sat idle, consuming food, so the smartest commanders turned siege engineering into a kind of flat pack assembly. They would have the major components crafted in advance: the throwing arm, the counterweight box, the frame beams. These parts would be transported by wagon. On arrival, carpenters only had to assemble the pieces, like a grim, oversized puzzle. This prefabrication could slash construction time from a month to a matter of days. It was logistics as a weapon, a way to bring force to bear before the defender's hope could harden into resolve. The castle's architecture evolved as a direct counter to this. If the attacker's goal was speed, the defender's goal was to manufacture delay. Every feature was engineered to waste the enemy's most precious asset. The complex Barbican wasn't just a fortified outwork, it was a temporal sinkhole. Attackers couldn't just charge the main gate. They first had to fight their way through this outer structure. A miniature fortress that could consume days or weeks. Then came the approach to the gate itself. Many castles abandoned straight entrance passages. Instead, they built chicanes, a narrow stone corridor that forced a sharp right turn, then an immediate left. It might zigzag. This meant a battering ram team couldn't get a running start. They had to maneuver their heavy weapon around these corners, inch by inch, under constant attack from above. What should have taken minutes now took hours. Each hour was a gift. Even the classic moat evolved. Instead of one wide ditch, some castles had a series of smaller, segmented ditches, each with its own removable bridge. An attacking force might fill the first ditch with rubble and cross, only to face a second identical obstacle and a third. Each crossing required pause. More labor, more exposure. It was a grinding, demoralizing process of repeated effort. This philosophy transformed the entire castle layout into a temporal maze. The goal wasn't necessarily to stop the enemy forever at the outer wall. It was to force them to pay for every single step forward in the only coin that mattered: time. A day spent reducing a Barbican was a day a relief force could march closer. An afternoon lost maneuvering a ram was an afternoon the besiegers' food stores dwindled. In this calculus, a castle's success wasn't always measured by whether it was ultimately taken. It was measured by how long it held. A fortress that could stretch a siege from 1 month to 3 might see the attacking army dissolve from starvation. Its walls might be breached, but its design had already achieved a deeper victory. It had manipulated the duration of the conflict, turning the attacker's strength, his numbers, his engines, into a slow-burning liability. The stone itself became a clock. Every clever angle in its passageways was a hand on the dial, ticking toward a reprieve. A castle that came through a siege was changed. The stones remembered: a wall that was breached, a tower that fell. That wasn't just damage, it was a lesson. And when they rebuilt, it wasn't about putting things back the way they were. It was a chance to adapt, to get stronger right where it had been weak. A hole made by a trebuchet wasn't just filled in with the same stone. The new patch would be thicker. Maybe a denser stone or set at a different angle. A section miners had undermined wasn't just built back up. They might dig the foundation deeper, down to bedrock. Or slope the base of the wall outward, a talus, so the next mining attempt would be harder. This repair was a conversation with the last attacker. The castle was learning from its wounds. You can see that history in the stone. Look at a place like Corfe Castle. You'll see patches of different colored rock, places where the pattern of the stones shifts suddenly. A band of darker, rougher stone cutting through the original, smoother facing. That's not a mistake. It's a scar that healed stronger. Each patch tells you something. That darker stone might be from a quarry they opened after the siege because it was harder. The changed pattern might show where a square tower was rounded after its flat face proved too vulnerable. The castle becomes a palimpsest, a manuscript where each generation wrote over the last, but you can still see traces of the old text. The history isn't just in the grand design. It's in the seams that turns the idea of innovation upside down. We think of castle design as something planned from the start by an architect or a patron. And sometimes it was, but just as often, the most important changes were organic. They came from the gritty work of repair. A local mason, told to fix a wall shattered by the new gunpowder cannons, wouldn't just copy what was there. He'd think he'd make it thicker where it broke, he might curve it. He was solving a problem he'd just seen with his own eyes. His solution from that direct experience became part of the castle's new reality. The proof was in the patch surviving, so the fortress transformed in a cycle, stress and response etched right into its fabric. An attack was a brutal test. The repair was the analysis and the upgrade all at once. That meant the castle was never really finished. It was a living document of conflict, constantly editing itself. Each siege added a chapter, written not in ink but in mortar and harder stone. The silent walls were speaking, telling a story of resilience written in the language of repair. The stone had its blueprint, but the mind had its library. Every scar on a repaired wall, somewhere a scholar was taking notes. The brutal trial and error of the battlefield, it started finding its way onto parchment. This was the moment the art of breaking walls and the science of building them became something you could study, not just learn from a master. You could read about it in a book. Manuscripts began to circulate. One of the most famous was called Belfries, written by a man named Conrad Kaiser around the year 1400. It wasn't a dry manual, it was more a catalogue of military dreams. Its pages were filled with illustrations of impossible machines, siege towers that were also ships, catapults of fantastical design. Many of these engines were never built, but the book represented a shift. It showed siegecraft was worthy of curiosity, of being collected, illustrated, debated. It was becoming a field of knowledge. More practical minds followed. Engineers like Mariano Toccola, Francesco di Giorgio Martini. They kept notebooks. These weren't just diaries, they were working documents filled with precise sketches, gears, pulleys, and most importantly, fortification plans. They began to analyze why a rounded tower worked better than a square one. They calculated angles of deflection. They experimented with the ideal thickness for a wall facing the new gunpowder artillery. They were treating military architecture not as a collection of tricks but as a system with underlying principles. You could derive rules from it. This was the birth of fortification as a formal discipline. The mason's intuitive feel for stone was now being supplemented by the engineer's calculated diagram. The impact of this work was profound. Before, a brilliant defensive feature invented in Bohemia might take a generation to spread to Italy, carried only by the memory of traveling soldiers or captured engineers. Now the idea could be drawn in a notebook. That notebook could be copied. The copies could travel by merchant caravan, by diplomatic pouch. Best practices became standardized. The response to a common threat like the mining attack was no longer a local secret. It was a published solution. A lord in Spain facing a siege could consult a treatise that distilled lessons learned decades earlier in the Holy Land. The theorist's pen had become a force multiplier. It ensured that hard-won knowledge was preserved, that it could leap across borders. This created a shared European language of fortification. The same geometric problems were being solved by minds in France, Germany, Italy. All referencing similar texts, they began speaking in the same technical terms: ravelins, bastions, glacis. This shared vocabulary accelerated innovation exponentially. An engineer didn't have to start from scratch. He could build upon the documented failures and successes of others. The pace of change, already driven by the pressure of war, was now supercharged by the efficiency of shared knowledge. The ultimate expression of this journey was still to come. It would crystallize in the Renaissance, in the perfect geometric ideals of the Star Fort. Those sprawling, angular fortresses were not accidents. They were the final product, centuries of practical experience, filtered through generations of analytical minds. And committed to paper, the castle's evolution from a fortified home to a mathematical diagram of defense. That was a journey guided as much by ink and intellect as by the hammer and the cannonball. The library, in the end, became another kind of arsenal. The strongest wall was the one in the defender's mind. A siege was a slow pressure, a contest of will. And the architecture understood that. It served a second purpose, to sustain the spirit inside the stone. Every feature was calibrated for endurance. The Great Hall, for instance. In peacetime, it was for feasting. Under siege, it became the heart. That vast, open space fought isolation. The garrison would gather there, to hear news, to get orders, to share a meal. Just coming together, seeing faces in the firelight, it dispelled the fear of confinement. And the high ceiling, often painted with stars, it lifted the gaze. A deliberate counter to the weight of the walls, a reminder of a world beyond. That's where the Lord would speak, reinforcing their shared purpose, turning individuals back into a unified defense. Then there was the chapel. Its thick, quiet walls were a sanctuary, a place for solace, for rites, for reflection. The stained glass cast colored light even on dark days. It affirmed a deeper order. It suggested their struggle had meaning beyond the fight, a psychological anchor, and the living quarters they considered light and air. Narrow windows followed the sun's path, fighting the gloom. Ventilation shafts carried away dampness, preventing illness. These weren't luxuries, they were interventions against the erosion of hope. Even the most humble spaces, the garderobe, the toilet, it was more than practical. Its design offered privacy and sanitation. Maintaining that basic dignity was a defense against dehumanization. In a siege, such provisions for normalcy became profound. They preserved order when everything outside was chaos, and throughout, symbols reinforced this. Heraldic shields on the walls, fireplaces with the Lord's crest, tapestries of heroic tales. They were constant reminders of the authority they served, the legacy they protected. So the castle wasn't a passive container, it was an active participant. Its stones were arranged not just to stop projectiles but to quiet anxieties. To foster community, to kindle the will, because the engineers knew a breach in morale could bring down a fortress long before any miner's tunnel reached its foundation. That conversation in stone still echoes. It echoes in how we think about security. The medieval arms race between the castle and the siege engine was a kind of laboratory. A lab for principles that go beyond that time. It was a relentless test of adaptation. A lesson that no defense is permanent, only the need for it is. Every time a new weapon appeared, like the trebuchet or the cannon, it forced a reinvention, not just of walls but of imagination. You see the castle evolve from a wooden tower to a geometric star fort. That's a story of human ingenuity under pressure. A direct challenge can spark these indirect, brilliant solutions. The moat answered the miner, the rounded tower answered the catapult. The layered fortress answered the fear of what could be thrown over the wall. Each response was a leap in understanding, and this dynamic reshaped more than architecture. It concentrated political power. Power went to those who could afford the latest, most expensive designs. It professionalized warfare. It created a class of engineers and mercenaries whose knowledge crossed borders. It embedded these structures so deeply into the landscape and our memory that they define an era. When we look at a ruin now, we're not just looking at a broken building. We're reading a fossilized dialogue. Each scar from a battering ram, each curve of a bastion is a sentence in a long argument, an argument about safety and power. The empty arrow slits are like eyes. They once watched for the next threat, forever fixed on a horizon, fixed on where the next question would come from. This history reminds us that challenge and response are the engines of change. The principles learned in that forge redundancy, defense in depth, the use of terrain, they didn't vanish with the age of knights. They inform modern cybersecurity, they inform urban planning, they speak to a timeless human endeavor to create a space of safety in a world of constant threat. The ruined castle on the hill stands as a monument to that endless, ingenious struggle. It's a testament to resilience, to the idea that we build not to be impervious but to adapt and to endure.